Hello, everybody. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Colin Dueck. I'm a fellow here at AEI. I'm very happy to welcome Congressman Mike Gallagher today. He's a Republican representative for Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was first elected in 2016, and he has won by landslide 3 times. Born in Green Bay, served 7 years on active duty as a U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, was twice deployed to Iraq. He completed his BA at Princeton and his PhD at Georgetown University. He wrote about U.S. national security strategy under Eisenhower, so we share the fact that we're Eisenhower fans. And he's a Green Bay Packers fan, needless to say. In Congress, he's made a name for himself as a leading Republican voice in the House on national security issues, particularly China, I would say. And he's here today to discuss the future of U.S. national security policy with us. Please join me in welcoming Mike Gallagher. So, Mike, we'll start with a little bit on China. The first question, there seems to be general agreement now that China is kind of the -- long-term challenge. What I want to get from you is a sense of how do you think President Biden is handling that challenge, and what would you do different, if anything?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thanks to all of you for coming. You forgot the most important part of my bio, which is that you were on my dissertation committee.
That's true.
So, did you actually read my dissertation?
No, I never read it.
Okay. I was shocked you passed.
I'm kidding, of course I read it.
Yeah, it was brilliant. It was brilliant. I think thinking about it as a long-term challenge, I think illustrates what is perhaps the primary point of contention. Yes, I think there's bipartisan consensus that China is our biggest long-term threat, and we tend to think about this as a long-term marathon. But, and this is a big but, this is a marathon that could be over with a quick sprint if we don't get some things right quickly. And I think there's dramatic disagreement about the urgency with which we need to defend Taiwan from a prospective invasion from the Chinese mainland. And there, I do not think that the Biden administration is moving anywhere near fast enough. If you look at the defense strategy that the Biden administration has put out, if you look at the 2 defense budgets that the Biden administration has proposed, all of it proposes this idea that we are going to divest to invest. So we're going to shed near-term conventional capability in order to invest in long-term technology that's going to emerge in the 2030s and suddenly save us from all the national security threats we face. Well, if you think that the Taiwan threat is a here and now issue, that we're in the window of maximum danger right now, if you agree with former Indo-Pacific Commander Phil Davidson that they could invade within the next 5 years, if you take Xi Jinping seriously when he talks repeatedly about his intention to unify Taiwan with the mainland by force if necessary, then we cannot wait until the mid-2030s to field capabilities that will deter the PLA by denial in Taiwan. And I think there's a disagreement about the urgency, and I don't think we're moving quickly enough. And oh, by the way, we're depleting stockpiles of certain key munitions that we're going to need because of the crisis in Ukraine. So that would be my first point. And then I think there's just this very complicated question of how do you selectively decouple key parts of our economy from China, which we have yet to forge a consensus around. And what's remarkable is that even after 2 years of a devastating pandemic that emerged from China, U.S. capital, technology, and data continues to flow into China. And though we've taken some important steps to get at this issue, for example, the Trump administration prevented federal retirement money from being invested in China. I mean, that was just a drop in the bucket. That was $4.5 billion. There's over $1 trillion worth of U.S. bond holdings in China right now. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on selective economic decoupling before it's too late. That has not been done. And oh, by the way, would hamper our ability to mobilize in the event of a conventional conflict with China. The final thing I would say, specific to the Biden administration, my sense is that they're divided on the China issue, or at least there's 2 sort of factions that are at play, and that explains why at times their China policy seems incoherent. There is a more realist faction that I think agrees with a lot of my views, or just let's say, conservative internationalist views on China, and that they are our biggest long-term threat and short-term threat. And then there is what I would call sort of a climate change camp that believes the foremost threat is not China, but rather climate change. And that means that we need to cooperate at times with China. And that's a tension that needs to be resolved, and it has not yet been resolved in the Biden administration.
Just to follow up on one thing you said about the need for increased investment, can you offer some specifics of what you think we should be investing in, given the urgency of the situation in Taiwan?
Well, things we need to be investing in ourselves domestically, most obviously semiconductors, chips. If China were to take over Taiwan, they would control 80% of the world's semiconductor manufacturing. We have some companies that are investing in domestic fabs here, but we're not moving fast enough. And if you think about it, I think really the challenge for people like me in public office when we talk about Taiwan is we have to do a better job of explaining this to the American people, explaining why it matters. And if we sort of just assume that if China were to make a move on Taiwan, that the American people will mobilize in defense of Taiwan, that Congress would authorize military force, I don't know. Unless we do a better job of explaining the stakes, I'm not sure that's true. And one of the reasons that we should be interested in defending Taiwan is that if China were to have control of the island in general and TSMC in particular, they would be able to hold the rest of the world economically hostage by controlling semiconductor manufacturing. So we have to figure out a way to bring more of that semiconductor manufacturing back home here domestically. That's a very difficult thing to do. We're proposing to spend tens of billions of dollars to do just that, but we are asking in return for companies that might receive that money from the federal government to give us assurances that they're not going to increase their production in China and thereby negate the whole effort. So it's very complicated. So that's one thing. One area that I think the CCP is increasingly talking about, they've talked about biological warfare as the next strategic deterrent. And what's remarkable to me is that companies that are effectively Chinese state-owned companies like BGI, which is formerly the Beijing Genomics Institute, or someone check me on that, other companies that have explicit relationships with the Chinese Academy of National Sciences, which is the parent organization of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, are building infrastructure here in the United States, making massive investments from the left coast to the east coast, and we're doing absolutely nothing about it, despite having given the executive branch, through the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, more tools to get at things exactly like this. We have institutes of higher education across the country that are investing their endowments in Chinese technology companies, Chinese defense companies, and U.S. capital just continues to flow into that space as well. So I think it's kind of a two-step process of figuring out a way to onshore critical technology, whether it's semiconductors or pharmaceutical development, or nearshore it, as well as then cutting off the flow of U.S. capital, U.S. technology, and U.S. data to China. And I really do think that's what makes this competition with China so unique and different from the old Cold War. We never had to consider selective economic decoupling from the Soviet Union because our economies didn't really interact, whereas we are so thoroughly entwined with China right now, and in many cases, as a result of that, we are financing our own destruction right now.
Right. This concept of integrated deterrence has come up with this administration. What is it, and what do you make of it?
Well, it's jargon, is what it is. It's new jargon that we don't need. It obscures, I think, like how we traditionally think about deterrence, which is deterrence by denial versus deterrence by punishment. And my rule is that if you're going to introduce a new acronym or a new bit of jargon into the lexicon, particularly the Department of Defense lexicon, you need to subtract at least 3 existing forms of jargon, and they have yet to do that. If you dig into it, and if you sort of analyze what's publicly available about the National Defense Strategy, as well as speeches that Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary of Defense Kath Hicks and Colin have given on this concept, the basic idea is that by better integrating new technology, allies, and soft power into conventional hard power, we can get more defense at less cost. If you look at their latest budget, pretty much the only increase, inflation adjusted, is in the R&D budget, which gets to the problem I alluded to earlier. What technology is going to emerge in the next 5 years that's going to solve our vexing problems, particularly in the Indo-Pacific? The Pentagon's talking about JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. Not going to be done within that window. Also, serious questions about whether it is truly going to be joint and whether it's even functional in a realistic way. So I think the technology piece is misguided. It amounts to fetishizing technology in the way we've previously relied or hoped for a third offset to emerge in order to solve a lot of our defense problems and give us a way to spend less money on defense without compromising our own security. On allies, I think it's a mixed bag right now, right? I think it's fair to say, and I'll give the Biden administration credit, even though integrated deterrence failed in Ukraine, for working very closely with some of our European allies who are now waking up to the fact that they need to invest in their own defense. But in other regions of the world, the Biden administration has angered traditional allies. Look at the Middle East, where it seems like we're walking away from the productive framework of the Abraham Accords in order to potentially resurrect the Iran deal for no good geostrategic reason. And I think in Indo-PACOM, we still don't have basing agreements with key allies that we need in order to defend Taiwan from Chinese aggression. So allies is a mixed bag at best. And then soft power, the more you examine this concept, I think it is a way to justify cuts to hard power based on the idea that diplomacy or sanctions can make up the difference. And I would submit to you that that idea was tested in Ukraine. The months leading up to the Ukraine crisis and the invasion of Ukraine on February 24th were a near perfect test of integrated deterrence. The administration relied on the threat of sanctions as well as relentless diplomacy and mean tweets in order to deter Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine. And it did not work. It failed. And the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs recently, integrated deterrence is a smokescreen for cuts to conventional hard power. I think it is very, very dangerous. And if we don't learn the lesson of why and how deterrence failed in Ukraine and then apply it to Taiwan, I would submit to you that we are going to be in a very difficult situation in the next few years, particularly after the next election in Taiwan, which I think is January of 2024. Other than that, I think integrated deterrence is great. But
Right. So your background in the Marines, given these shifts to great power competition, particularly China, but also Ukraine, tell us a little bit about what role do you think the Marines can play? Do you have any particular thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, okay. If you look at what the PLA has done in the last 2 decades, it's not just that they've built the largest Navy in the world, which they have, and an increasingly capable Navy. The Secretary of the Navy, our Secretary of the Navy, recently said that, they build more ships than we do, but our ships are more capable. Their ships aren't that good. I think that's dangerous. I think that's complacent. I mean, if you really start to examine some of their ship classes, their Luyangs, their Renhais, I mean, these are very, very capable ships. But put that aside. Put aside the fact that in a theater, our most important theater of operations, that if you look at the map of it, it's mostly water. So it would lead you to conclude that you need a navy, you need sea power in order to be effective. Put aside the fact that the Chinese are surpassing us right now. Look, what they've really done is build an anti-navy in the last 2 decades with their rocket force, right? And that's a very brilliant idea because it puts them on the right side of the cost curve. Basically, they're able to hold our ships at risk with long-range fires that are relatively not that expensive. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to flip the script on that. We need stand-in forces that can operate inside the weapons engagement zone of the PLA rocket force in particular, but the PLA in general. If you think about that, that's submarines. We're not building enough submarines. We're not building them fast enough. That's Marines armed with long-range fires. And perhaps the best thing we did in the Trump administration, we'll take credit for it in Congress because we had an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that forced them to study the issue. So I will take credit for it. We got out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So no longer bound by the strictures of that treaty, which of course China is not a party to. So we can field all these ground-launched missile systems that we couldn't field before. And things start to get pretty exciting when you have small teams of Marines dispersed throughout the northern Philippines and southern Japanese islands in particular that are able to target PLA ships and sink them if necessary. That puts us on the right side of the cost curve. And then if you take that another step further and start getting really creative by containerizing those fires. So think about putting a bunch of VLS tubes in vertical launch system tubes, or Monty's an actual Navy expert, so he's taking notes and correcting me on everything I'm saying wrong right now. Also was the executive director of our cyberspace commission, did a fantastic job. By the way, while I'm at it, Reed worked for me on my first campaign. Great job right there. I steal a lot of ideas from Yuval Levin in the back, so it's a great group we have. You think about like a Connex box with a bunch of missiles inside of it, and the PLA doesn't know if it's just a regular Connex box or it's filled with missiles. That would really complicate their decision-making cycle. We can start to do that. The final thing I'd say related to Ukraine is that we need to urgently replenish our stockpiles of munitions right now. We've blown through about 7 years worth of javelins. We've blown through 30% of our Stinger arsenal. The lesson of Ukraine is that you need to arm your allies and partners before the invasion happens. And if we don't replenish our own stockpiles as well as deliver key weapon systems to the Taiwans, we are going to be in a bad situation. And I think the Marine Corps can play a role in helping the Taiwans fight better as well. So just a few loose thoughts on that.
Is there any other element of the U.S. defense posture in, let's say, the Indo-Pacific that you think should really be highlighted as something in need of bolstering or revision or adjustment?
Yeah. Well, one thing, we've had a debate. I'm a navalist. I'm a sea power enthusiast. I love my Army brethren, but I think looking at a map of the Indo-Pacific, as I said before, it's clear that this is the main effort is the Navy and the Air Force. The Army has an important role to play, but they're not the main effort. The one joint mission of the Army is to do ground-based air defense or low-cost intercept, and it's a mission that they can't fulfill right now. That's something we need to figure out. It's a huge gap for us at present. But I do think a more explicit prioritization among the services is something that only the commander-in-chief can achieve. And what's been missing for the last, I would argue, decade at least, is a president who is able to make the case for why we need to grow the size of the Navy urgently. I mean, look at the Navy's plan right now. They just released their 30-year shipbuilding plan. We go from about 297 ships today to about 280 by the end of the 5-year defense plan. That's the worst possible moment to be bottoming out, right? That's right at 2027, which is the end of the so-called Davidson window. Admiral Phil Davidson warned that this is the window in which the Chinese can make a move on Taiwan. So we're bottoming out. We're going to be most vulnerable when it's likely that the PLA will be most aggressive. Bad idea. And I've been playing Lucy and Charlie Brown. I'm Charlie Brown in this analogy with the football when it comes to growing the Navy since the day I entered Congress. And we all sat there and we said, you know what? After studying this for years, doing multiple outside reviews, we need a 355-ship Navy. We actually put that into law, that it should be the policy of the United States to get to a 355-ship Navy as soon as practically possible, and we're going backwards. We're going backwards on that. That is a problem we need to solve, and I've come to believe that only in the same way that the 600-ship Navy was only possible because Reagan himself invested his political capital in it, this problem will only be solved by a commander-in-chief who believes in American sea power, and we just haven't had that. And so we're on the cusp of having our third failed pivot to the Pacific in a row due to a combination of reasons. One, in not prioritizing the Navy adequately. Two, seeing deterrence failures in other theaters that are going to consume our bandwidth. And three, I would argue, as a recovering Arabist, just getting the basic alliance structure wrong in the Middle East, and that's going to produce chaos.
Let me shift to the midterms.
Ooh.
Fun stuff.
Yeah.
And the role of foreign policy. I mean, the conventional wisdom is always that foreign policy is not an issue. But, there have been some interesting events the last year. You've had the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. You've had the invasion of Ukraine. I want to get your take, for starters, on, do you think any of these issues are going to carry weight in the midterms?
Well, I should say, for anyone interested in examining the intersection of politics and U.S. foreign policy, the best place to start is with Colin's books on the subject, both Hardline and Reluctant Crusaders, instant classics. He didn't tell me to say that, by the way. I've actually read them. Well, I get, and you would know better than I mean, the conventional wisdom, certainly, the literature among political scientists, I think, suggests no, foreign policy doesn't matter. But that's only, I think, if you think about it as people going into the voting booth and making decisions based on a particular valence issue that happens to be a foreign policy issue. And I'm not sure that's the way it works. I think there's a way in which foreign policy matters because the American people want to feel like we have a competent commander-in-chief who is keeping the country safe. And when you don't have that feeling, and that feeling could be the product of a bunch of different foreign policy issues adding up, then I do think foreign policy matters. I would argue foreign policy mattered in the 2016 election. That was my first election, and if you remember at the time, there was just a wave of high-profile terrorist attacks abroad and even here at home. There was an attack in San Bernardino. There was a growing sense that the homeland was not safe from the threat of Salafi jihadist terrorist groups that I would say was connected to some major foreign policy blunders the Obama administration made, most notably precipitously getting out of Iraq and squandering the gains of the surge for purely political purposes, as well as establishing and then abandoning a red line in Syria that caused utter chaos in the Middle East and allowed the rise of ISIS to occur. I had people asking me as I was campaigning, is it safe to go to a Packers game? I mean, if the state of American leadership has languished to the point that it affects Lambeau Field, then foreign policy matters in an election. So what does that mean for this midterm? My honest answer is I don't know. I think it's interesting that Biden's poll numbers tanked right as he made a series of mistakes related to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think there was a sense that the administration was not being honest about what they were trying to achieve. They tried to spin it as a logistical success, and I really think that angered a lot of people, as well as punctured whatever honeymoon period or goodwill he had as a new president. And so, in that sense, foreign policy matters in this election. I don't think Afghanistan's going to be the top issue in the election. If you consider energy policy to be a subset of national security, and I do, then I do think it matters in the midterm. Gas was $4.09 in Green Bay when I left yesterday. That's like pretty expensive. It's probably worse here. What's it here? $4.30, something like that. That's directly connected to bad geopolitical decisions as well as bad domestic decisions. So I don't know if any of that makes sense. You give me your take on it. But I do think after Afghanistan, it's going to, and notwithstanding some of the unity we now have on Ukraine, it's going to be hard for Biden to recover that sense of a competent commander-in-chief with his hands firmly on the ship, whatever metaphor, steering the ship of state in the right direction. And in that sense, I do think foreign policy will matter in this election.
Well, as you say, it doesn't seem to be a total coincidence that President Biden's approval rating went down at about the time of the Afghan fiasco, and it's never gone up.
Yeah.
If you think about the Ukraine invasion, this is interesting because he doesn't seem to get much credit for his response. I mean, there's been no rally effect. His support is still exactly where it's been, which is it's not great.
Yeah.
Do you think he doesn't get enough credit, or do you think that the public's assessment of how he's handling Ukraine is about right?
I think it's about right. Well, here's what I guess, to be honest, what is anger is the wrong word. What I think has been unwise is that you have high-level Biden administration officials openly bragging, or at least anonymously bragging, to the Washington Post about the success of their strategy in Ukraine, and using it as evidence that this integrated deterrence strategy is a good strategy. well, it ignores the obvious fact that deterrence failed in Ukraine, and thousands of people are losing their lives as a result of that, and this country's being destroyed in the process. And I think that hubris is undermining a lot of the goodwill that they could have gotten from their efforts after the collapse of deterrence in Ukraine. One stray thought on our previous thing. One way in which Afghanistan may matter, I know we're all preoccupied with Russia and, of course, China, but there are still terrorist groups out there that would like nothing more than to kill Americans. Part of the problem with the withdrawal from Afghanistan is not only the incompetent way in which it was conducted, but we are now reliant on so-called over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations. I think this is very naive. I think it's going to be very difficult for us to conduct counterterrorism with the same intelligence we had before, because our ability to collect intelligence was in many ways dependent on having people on the ground. I say that as a former human intelligence officer. You need to talk to humans in order to be able to get humans. And then there are real logistical problems with doing counterterrorism strikes from over the horizon. And so I worry about the resurgence of Salafi jihadism as an issue. I'm not trying to scare anyone right now, but that's something we can't take our eye off of, because it could be a problem here very quickly.
It strikes me there's another issue that could be considered foreign policy or national security. If you look at public opinion polls, most Republican voters, at least, consider border security to be a legitimate national security issue. Obviously, that's one area where there's deep disagreement between the two parties. It seems to be an issue in the fall midterms. What's your view on that?
Well, I agree. I think it's going to be a top 3 issue in the midterm. And as for the intersection with national security, we had something like 42 people apprehended at the southern border that were on one of the terrorism watch lists. So there's an obvious connection there. In my mind, I tend to think about it more as a law and order issue, and I connect it to just ongoing problems across the United States and in my district related to drug use and fentanyl. And I come from a northern border state. We're more worried about those evil Canadians like you than we are about the southern border at times, but it affects northeast Wisconsin. We've had cartel-related killings in Oconto County, Wisconsin. So it does quite literally affect the safety of communities in my district to have a porous border and to have misguided immigration policies. And I do think that is going to be a top 3 issue in the midterms, regardless of whether you think about it as a law and order issue or as a national security issue. I mean, it's sort of obviously both.
You mentioned the Canadian threat. Do you want to elaborate on that?
We can never sleep on the Canadian threat. I dislike, as someone who's going bald, I dislike anyone who has great hair like Trudeau, to say nothing of his politics. And I've long advocated for what I would call the Wexit, which is the secession of certain Western Canadian provinces and our assumption of those provinces in the United States. So, but you're the expert on that.
It's an exciting thought.
I see a lot of commonalities between Saskatchewan and...
there are. So, I mean, is there anything else you hear from voters in Wisconsin that either counts as sort of national security, defense, foreign policy? What seems to be on people's minds?
In addition to what we've talked about, well, I do think there's, if you're going to rank the issues, inflation and general economic concerns are top of mind, connected to bad energy policies we've talked about before. I think that issue is going to get much, much worse, particularly if the Biden administration decides to magically cancel a bunch of student debt. That will be massively inflationary. Border security. I do think there is how do I put this? What I hear most often from conservatives in my district, so let's say Republican primary voters, is a sense that no one is ever held accountable for anything, and a growing frustration over that fact. And so I think there is a demand among certainly among conservatives, and let's say even center-right and maybe some independents, that beyond passing any particular piece of legislation, if we take back the House and the Senate, we need to rediscover, they wouldn't put it this way, but this is how I interpret it, rediscover our ability to do basic oversight of the executive branch to ensure that when people break the rules, they're held accountable, or when taxpayer dollars are spent imprudently, we understand it and we prevent it from happening again. And so I almost think that some of the most important work to be done in the next Congress, if we control it as Republicans, involves investigating certain things, whether it was the botched surrender and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether it is the origins of COVID-19 and the way in which US taxpayer dollars funded cooperative research with Chinese scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and leading public health officials advocated for so-called gain-of-function research that may have been related to the outbreak of this virus, or whether it is more controversial things, like the way in which 50 former top-level intelligence officials went out and told us that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation. That may be less fun to talk about than bipartisan matters of geopolitics, but I think we owe it to our constituents to revitalize our basic oversight and investigative functions. And maybe if we do that, we can start to get at a problem that I think you've always written about better than anyone, which is Article 1 clawing back all of the constitutional authority that it has surrendered to Article 2, the executive branch. And if we do that, maybe we can take some of the sort of partisan blood sport that we engage in every 4 years for these life or death presidential elections. Maybe we can tone that down a little bit. That to me that's the world I want to live in. So I don't have constituents saying, I will only vote for you if you restore Article 1's constitutional authority, but there are ways in which it's expressed in my district that don't fall neatly into a particular policy bucket. I think it's mostly expressed as frustration over Congress not being able to hold the executive branch accountable for manifest failures, if that makes sense at all.
So it looks like Republicans are more than likely going to take control of the House. You'll be one of the leading voices on national security. It sounds like what you're saying is, starting January next year, oversight as much as anything is what's going to be the priority. What do you think congressional Republicans are going to be emphasizing on national security next year?
Well, I would say, and we've had a lot of discussions to this effect. Those of us who tend to focus on national security, defense, and intelligence issues in the Republican caucus, we would very much like the discussion on China to remain a bipartisan discussion. And I think there's a way in which, even over the last 4 or 5 years, where we've had extreme partisan gridlock in this town, on national security, China-related matters, we've done a lot of things productively and in bipartisan fashion. And when it comes to some things that I talked about earlier, like how do we wean ourselves off of our dependency on Chinese manufacturing in key areas? How do we shore up some of our supply chain vulnerabilities? How do we revitalize semiconductor manufacturing? My hope is that we can maintain that as a bipartisan effort, and we can put forward a series of legislative efforts that are serious and that can pass even in a divided Congress. I would submit to you that the China Task Force, of which I was a member, and I think Leader McCarthy, to his credit, had the foresight to establish, is evidence of that sincere attempt to have politics stop at the water's edge, though you would probably remind me that it never has actually stopped at the water's edge when it comes to the issue of China. We invited the Democrats to join that effort. Speaker Pelosi did not let her members join it, even though I know for a fact many wanted to, for purely partisan reasons. But the offer is open for them to join us in crafting serious China-related legislation in the next Congress. And so I think you're just going to see, in addition to oversight investigation, I think you're going to see China in general and the defense of Taiwan from PLA aggression in particular as a key priority for the Republican caucus. And I would further say, as a new member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, I think a priority for a Republican-controlled House is going to be restoring that committee's role as a serious place to do serious oversight and legislative work when it comes to the U.S. Intelligence Committee, particularly in light of the long-term and short-term threat posed by China, after a few years in which Democratic leadership has turned that into a much more partisan committee. And I think those three things right there provide a lot of opportunities to do serious work going forward, in addition to just our annual exercise on the Armed Services Committee to do the National Defense Authorization Act, which remains a very bipartisan and serious effort, and one of the few committees that actually still works in a good way, and does a good oversight of the executive branch.
I will just pick up, you mentioned the Middle East. I just want to give you a chance to talk about that. I mean, there's different criticisms that have been leveled at the Biden administration, but how do you think they're handling the region as a whole, in particular U.S. relations with allies and partners in the Middle East?
I feel like one of the best achievements of the Trump administration was the Abraham Accords. I remember when we got to know each other, I think probably in 2015 or around then, and I was working on the Walker campaign at the time, and I went to some conference where I spoke, not on his behalf, but I spoke as a member of the campaign, and at the time, I sort of said, when it comes to the Middle East, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. It's the best of times because we are seeing a historic level of cooperation between Israel and the Sunni Arab Gulf states, things we've never seen before. But it's the worst of times because that is a de facto emerging partnership or regional alliance bloc built in opposition to U.S. policy. In other words, both the Israelis and the Saudis and all the Gulfies did not like the fact that we were pursuing a policy of rapprochement with the Iranian regime. And the Trump administration, to their credit, both abandoned the Iran deal and then built upon that cooperation between Israel and the Sunni Arab Gulf states that was then instantiated in the Abraham Accords. Rather than taking that and expanding it even further, I think the Biden administration is by pursuing a resuscitation of the Iran deal, is going to create chaos in the region. Now, it may be the case that no Iran deal is possible because the hardliners in Tehran won't accept any deal, despite repeated attempts by the Biden administration to give them everything they want, and attempts to figure out a way where they can remove the IRGC from the terrorist, from being designated as a terrorist organization, despite the fact that IRGC is actually trying to kill former high-level U.S. officials on U.S. soil. But I really think the Biden administration is missing an opportunity to build upon the logic of the Abraham Accords, as well as pursue interesting cooperation when it comes to energy. The UAE ambassador, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, wrote a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a year or 2 years ago talking about the nuclear agreement in the region that is working quite well. And it's the gold standard agreement we forged with the UAE, where they don't enrich domestically, but they have access to nuclear technology, and now they're powering something like 25% of their energy needs with nuclear power right now. There are all sorts of opportunities like that right now that we're missing because of this obsession with resurrecting the Iran deal. And by the way, President Biden, when he was campaigning, promised that any deal that they would forge with Iran would be longer and stronger than the original JCPOA. There is no universe in which JCPOA 2.0 will be longer and stronger than JCPOA 1.0. If for no other reason than we've already blown past a lot of the sunset provisions in the original Iran deal. So I'm very concerned about the Iran deal, and I think that's screwing up an attempt to, or screwing up an opportunity to build upon the framework of the Abraham Accords.
You wrote a piece recently for National Review called "Woke Warriors," I think, and we've seen anti-racism initiatives across the country the last few years, especially on college campuses, but on so many different institutions. And some think even at the Pentagon, it's gone a little bit out of control. I'm curious to have you tell us, particularly given your background, do you think this is a problem at the Department of Defense today? What is the problem?
Well, I should confess, I was initially tempted to just dismiss this. I'm not really, you don't see me on TV throwing culture war bombs a lot. I try to stay focused on, hard power and intel and the things where I feel like I know a little bit, I can contribute. But the more I dug into the issue, the more I came to believe it was a serious and growing problem. You mentioned higher education. I think it is true that the burgeoning DEI bureaucracy has turned institutions that are supposed to be bastions of free expression and free inquiry into hostile and ideologically homogenous environments where conservative views are not tolerated. And I think it's logical to assume that if the growing DEI bureaucracy has done that much damage to higher education, that if it gains a foothold in the Pentagon, it could do similar damage. Furthermore, once you start to examine a lot of the DEI documents that the Pentagon has put out there, you realize that it's based on bad social science. For example, the Department of the Navy, which the CNO and everyone is out there saying, diversity is our strength, diversity is our strength. If you read the documents that they put out on that, they cite studies such as an experiment that was done in 2014 and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where they took a bunch of people with backgrounds in finance, and then they divided them into two racial categories, basically a white category and a non-white category. And then they then divided it into two other groups that were exposed to diversity and groups that were not exposed to diversity. So basically, the groups that were not exposed to diversity were the white traders who then went to a cubicle and made bets on a fake stock market. And those that were exposed to diversity were white participants in the subject that then mingled with non-white participants for a few minutes and then went to their cubicles and made bets on a fake stock market. And then they used the results of those bets, examining, price bubbles in fake markets, to argue that those who had been exposed to diversity performed better financially than those that hadn't. So that's absurd. Like that, it's not clear to me that that's even applicable to the financial world, let alone to the specific business of asking young men and women to kill and be killed for their country. And yet that is one of two citations for the massive claims the Navy is making on racial and gender diversity. The other is a McKinsey study from 2015 called Diversity Matters, where they compare board diversity using a formula that is so complex and makes no sense when you start to play around with it a little bit. They compare board diversity to financial performance for publicly traded companies. They divide the data set into quartiles, but they only compare the top quartile to the bottom quartile. They omit half the data set. So it doesn't even tell you much about the correlation, if it exists at all, between board diversity and financial performance. Furthermore, the most recent meta-analyses on this subject actually are showing us the opposite, that certain DEI initiatives, such as implicit bias training and things like that, actually intensify intergroup hostility rather than alleviate it. So bad social science, point two, and it should trouble us if general and flag officers are uncritically citing bad social science, because it means something's going wrong with their staff process, and it should force us to question a lot of their other claims. And then finally, if you think this is all innocuous and it's not a problem that the CNO wants to put how to be an anti-racist on his reading list, and that it's not going to detract from warfighting readiness at a time when administrative requirements are already detracting our focus from warfighting, I think I think that's naive. I happen to know that there are a lot of people that feel that the Defense Department is increasingly politicized. I think that this is going to hurt our ability to recruit and retain talented warfighters. And more to the point, it seems like at some point in the last 5 years, we shifted our focus from marching towards an increasingly colorblind society, however asymptotic the achievement of that goal may be, towards an explicit focus on racial and gender differences that I fear is going to be incredibly divisive and stoke racial tension where it did not exist prior to these efforts. And that's what concerns me about the whole thing.
So sort of taking the worst aspects of the academy and bringing them into the U.S. Armed Forces.
Yes, yes.
Terrific, okay.
Yeah.
So let's shift focus to...
Oh, can I add one thing to that?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
please, yeah.
My staff gets very nervous when I talk about this topic. If you look at our foremost adversary, China, they are weaponizing the worst beliefs of woke America against us. Like if you examine the Twitter feeds of all the so-called CCP wolf warriors, it's a constant stream of nonsense about how America is an evil, racist hellscape. It's anti-cop rhetoric. I mean, it's if we give in to this narrative, we're giving them an unearned propaganda victory that I would say weakens our ability to effectively wage ideological warfare against the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, if in this struggle between us and China, if we don't believe that we're the good guys, I don't know how we can win.
Yeah. Well, let's shift to questions from the audience. I think we have a mic that can go around right over here.
Thanks, sir. Tom Spohr from Heritage. I'm curious what you make of the delay in the Biden administration's national security strategy. They at first said it was Ukraine, but that was months ago now, and maybe it was the fact that the budget came out so late, but that's now gone. Is it priorities, or what should we make of that?
I think there's a few things. One, they released their interim national security guidance or whatever they called it, and I think they feel like that gives them enough time to do whatever revisions are necessary in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I do think it's mostly the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has upended a lot of the assumptions in the document. But beyond that, quite honestly, I don't know. I don't understand the delay, but I do think it further it's odd to me that the Pentagon went out and released their national defense strategy. I know that our timeline on the Hill dictates some of that in terms of the annual authorization process and budget process, but we have a defense strategy without a national security strategy. That gets the sequencing of it entirely backwards right now. So the other thing it could be, and this is just a guess, I don't know. The Biden administration doesn't let me into the sort of internal debates about their national security strategy. It could be that divide on China and climate that I referenced before. It could be and this is true of the Trump administration as well. I think there's sort of a where you stand depends on where you sit problem with China, meaning that Treasury tends to have sort of a different perspective on China, a less hawkish position, whereas DOD and the NSC itself tend to take a more hawkish position, and that creates some contradictions. So I guess that's a long way of me saying I don't know. I mean, it's when did Trump release his national security strategy?
December of the year he was inaugurated.
Yeah, it's mystifying to me.
Let's see other questions in the corner there.
Shigaki from the Japanese Embassy. First of all, Congressman, thank you so much for your strong support for the alliance and also continued focus on East Asia, and also appreciation for the AI for this very timely event. I'd like to follow up Congressman's comment on the selective decoupling, or how to counter any kind of threats for intellectual property theft or the stealing of advanced technologies. Japan is, of course, also trying to work on that through its economic legislation, and at the embassy, we're following very closely the USICA or the ongoing discussion in the US. But I believe that many Asian countries in particular really eager to see more robust U.S. leadership role, especially in the area of rulemaking. I mean, U.S. is not only biggest market for these countries, for their market access to have their investment, but also for the high aspiration for setting a high standards, which was always leading role, and I think that pulled all the standards to make the level playing field for many countries. So we of course know the politics here, but I wonder, how do you see the integration of the national defense, national security, and also the economic statecraft, which is of course symbolizing like areas like chips or the AI or the 5G, 6Gs?
Well, thank you for the question. I think part of the concern with respect to Taiwan is that Las Vegas rules do not apply. What happens there would not stay there, and we feel like our ability to fulfill our treaty obligations with Japan would become more difficult if we do not, in the first instance, defend Taiwan. So I just want to emphasize how important I think our relationship is, now more than ever, I would say, and how much we welcome leadership in Japan and some of the debate that's happening there in terms of your ability to work with us and field a deterrence by denial posture in the region. When it comes to economic statecraft, selective decoupling, obviously a very complicated question that you asked. One of the things I think we learned in the last 5 years is just how important it is for us to show up in all of these international fora that exist. We had some contentious vote. It was the World Intellectual Property Organization, where we learned at the last stage that a more, let's say, China-friendly candidate to lead the organization was in the mix, and we had to scramble to try and offer an alternative. And it just goes to show that if you aren't out there actively, not just at the UN, but in all these obscure organizations that exist, actively contesting for influence, the CCP is going to take advantage of that. I mean, the apparatus they have, particularly with their United Front Work Department, which is multiples the size of our State Department, which Xi Jinping himself has called a magic weapon. I mean, their tentacles are in all of these organizations. So I guess my first point would be we have to show up in order to guard against malign CCP influence. Second, more specific point would be, I mentioned the flow of data from the United States to China. And if you're an American company doing business in China, you just have to assume that they're sucking up all your data. There's no reciprocity in the relationship at all right now. And more to the point, we have no regulatory mechanism for dealing with cross-border data flows right now. We have the beginnings of something with something called the ICTS. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in thinking about cross-border data flows that hasn't been done right now. I mentioned capital flows before this. To me, the most obvious solution would be to prohibit university endowments, particularly those institutions which receive tax subsidies or some sort of assistance from the federal government from investing in China, as well as couple that with an effort to say to the financial community that, okay, if you are going to pursue ESG-related goals, well, then you need to factor that into your investments in China. The G should stand for genocide. Perhaps one of the biggest wins we had legislatively in the waning days of the last Congress was passing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. In that bill, it creates a doctrine called rebuttable presumption, where if you want to do business in China, you have to rebut the presumption that your business is dependent on slave labor. That concept could be extended for a variety of investments in China, and I think that would be productive. And the final thing I would say is, though I have been an opponent of the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, and I opposed them when the previous president did it, who was from my own party. I thought it was an abuse of sort of national security concerns. I don't think we have a national security threat from Canadian steel or aluminum, notwithstanding what I said earlier about the Canadians. I think it would be a mistake, and I've long called for getting rid of the 232 tariffs. I think it would be a mistake to get rid of the Section 301 tariffs that we put in place on China. If you read the 301 investigation, it goes into extreme detail about the extent of intellectual property theft and a variety of malign CCP economic activities. And right now, I'm very concerned about the reports I've heard that the Biden administration may get rid of the 301 tariffs, perhaps as a way to alleviate economic pressure leading up to the midterms. The final, not exactly related thing, I would say, but it is related, right? Because one of the tools we have if and when China steals our intellectual property or spies on us in cyber is to go after them in cyberspace. We just learned today, officially, that the administration is going to change the rules of engagement for offensive cyber operations under a document called NSPM 13. This is one of the best things we've done in cyber in a bipartisan fashion in the last 4 years. We've loosened the rules of engagement and allowed people at Cybercom to go after it in cyberspace and launch operations with greater alacrity than they were able to do before. Now the Biden administration is reportedly considering putting more people into that decision-making process, specifically people from the State Department. That's going to slow down the pace of our cyber operations. I think that will be a massive, massive mistake. And it's unclear to me what constituency is clamoring for this change. I think if you ask a lot of my Democratic colleagues who work on cyber issues, they're not asking for NSPM 13 to be changed. So that's just a sampling of different things I think we need to do to get after that issue, but it's very, very complex. I'm sort of intrigued, too, if there isn't an opportunity when it comes to the Quad to do more collaboration, specifically on energy-related issues, or when it comes to fixing our rare earth dependency on China. And then also, when it comes, and this, I'll give the administration enormous credit for signing the AUKUS agreement, the agreement that we forged with the UK and with Australia. I've praised it. I don't detract from it at all, other than to say sort of the crown jewels of AUKUS, which is nuclear submarine collaboration and technology sharing, won't be fielded until the late 2030s at the earliest. We need to figure out how we use the AUKUS framework and something called the National Technology Industrial Base. We formally incorporated Australia into our National Technology Industrial Base. How we leverage that framework in order to turbocharge our technology collaboration and sharing in the short term to solve vexing short-term national security problems. And I think, as we look to expand those frameworks, Japan is the next logical partner for technology sharing or energy technology sharing and things like that.
Do you have time for one more
Sure.
quick question?
Yeah, I think
know
so.
I promised Chaz we would.
I've been too long-winded, I apologize.
Let's
People
see,
are falling
right
asleep
here.
everywhere.
Hi, my name's Jack. I'm a PhD research student. I noticed when you were chatting about the conversation where you discussed how much foreign policy influences elections. I wondered if you think that's maybe actually, instead of foreign policy affecting each cycle, if it actually comes more in lags, where like attitudes develop over time, and perhaps even like the Trump election and foreign policy approach that was towards more like a more isolationist one was more of a venting of disillusion amongst sections of Americans. And do you think that's something that might be something we'll see more in the future elections at all?
It's possible. I mean, he's the actual expert on these issues. I think it might be fair to say there's a general cycle of, well, maybe let me put this first in defense-specific terms, right? If you look at defense spending over a long term, it looks like a sine wave, right? Looks like this. So usually what's going on there is like we repeatedly tell ourselves this naive story that after wars have concluded, we can disarm, we can bring the boys home, and if you read sort of not only Colin's books but read This Kind of War by T.R. Fehrenbach about the Korean War, the American people traditionally have been more comfortable with crusades, or as he says, jihads, as opposed to political wars or wars by small legions. And so, as a result, we tend to disinvest in defense. That creates geopolitical chaos, and then we're forced to catch up and rearm on far more costly terms than if we just maintained a steady stream of investments over time. And I think that cycle does explain a lot of our shifting positions on foreign policy. Within the Conservative Party, though, I mean, the last isolationist we've ever nominated was the great Alf Landon in 1936, right? Is my timing correct on that? I would argue Trump was not he had rhetoric that was at times isolationist, but he did not govern as an isolationist. His Russia policy, which was perhaps the most controversial given some things he said, was actually very tough on Russia. There's scores of dead Russian mercenaries in Syria that would attest to that fact. So I don't think it's fair to say that the sort of isolationist wing, such as it exists in the Republican Party, is ascendant. And for those of us who consider ourselves more internationalist or primacist or defense hawks, whatever you want to say, I think it would be foolish for us to ignore the isolationist impulse such as it exists. I think prudence is a healthy impulse in geopolitics, and the way forward involves confronting head-on many of the failures in our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, and there were multiple failures. I think the American people deserve better than what they saw, particularly in the waning stages of the war. We have to confront that head on. I do think that some of my colleagues who may be more isolationist have a point when they talk about bloat in the Pentagon bureaucracy. We shouldn't tolerate waste anywhere, particularly in the Pentagon. But I think ultimately we have to do a better job of making the case that ours is fundamentally a defensive strategy. We are trying to defend the frontiers of freedom from authoritarian aggression right now. We're trying to defend our existing network of allies and partners from unprovoked authoritarian aggression. And that's different in my mind than making a case for democratic expansion. It's defense of existing, not just democracies, but allies, as opposed to actively promoting it abroad. Point one. Point two, I wonder if in the process of making all those mistakes we made in Iraq and Afghanistan, we arrived through a very painful and costly form of trial and error at a sustainable approach that allows us to have a reduced footprint in the Middle East and focus more on the Indo-Pacific and China, which is to say by working by, with, and through partners and allies on the ground and providing them intelligence, providing them certain air support, providing them training, we can help them fight for themselves rather than doing the fighting for them. That, to me, is an interesting strategy and one that I think would appeal to some of my more isolationist colleagues. And then finally, I just would say whatever tension has always existed in the Republican Party between, sort of the Taft wing and the Eisenhower wing, but even Taft he wasn't a true isolationist in any meaningful sense. He was skeptical of NATO, but he saluted, when Eisenhower stole the nomination from him and supported a lot of Eisenhower's efforts, although he died, I guess, after golfing with Eisenhower in 53 or 54. Golf is a dangerous sport, ladies and gentlemen. Don't play it. I think that the threat posed by China resolves a lot of that tension. I don't think there's much daylight in the Republican Party on that issue. And to the extent there were Republicans making the case that, the smart strategy for China over the long term is to work with Russia to balance against them, to triangulate Russia against China, well, I think Vladimir Putin has resolved that tension in favor of those of us who've always thought that was a very naive assumption, and there's no prospect of working with Putin's Russia in order to balance China over the long term. So hopefully some of that made sense. You should write your PhD dissertation about this and tell me what actually works.
Well, I'm so glad that Alf Landon got a shout out.
That's right.
Listen, it's been a great conversation, and please join me in thanking Congressman Gallagher.